Psychology can explain the human mind in exquisite detail, mapping neural pathways, dissecting behavior, and predicting patterns of thought with increasing precision. It can tell us why we fear, why we love, why we procrastinate, and even why we self-sabotage. Yet there remains a singular, unbridgeable gap, a realm that no experiment, therapy session, or cognitive model can fully illuminate. There is one thing psychology cannot teach you, no matter how sophisticated the studies, how compelling the data, or how brilliant the theories: the raw, unmediated experience of personal responsibility, the existential weight of choice, and the courage to act despite uncertainty. Consider the paradox. You can understand every cognitive bias, every emotional trigger, every neurological mechanism driving your decisions, and still fail to act differently. Awareness does not automatically translate into transformation. Psychology provides maps of the terrain, but it cannot make you traverse the mountains, navigate the storms, or confront the abyss within yourself. Why is this so? How can knowledge of behavior fail to produce behavioral change? And more profoundly, what does this limitation reveal about the human condition, free will, and the nature of authentic growth? By watching until the end, you will gain clarity on the existential frontier where psychology meets philosophy, a space where understanding alone is insufficient and true mastery demands courage, reflection, and deliberate engagement with the self. You will learn why knowledge, no matter how complete, cannot replace the act of living intentionally, and how embracing this paradox opens the door to a deeper, more authentic life. Philosophically, this limitation is starkly illustrated in Kierkegaard's notion of the leap of faith. Kierkegaard argues that the human being is suspended between knowledge and action, reflection and existence. Understanding your desires, fears, or patterns is insufficient. True living requires the leap, the conscious, existential choice to act, embrace responsibility, and confront the unknown. Nietzsche echoes this. The greatest truths are not learned. They are enacted through struggle, courage, and self-overcoming. Psychology can illuminate tendencies, but it cannot grant the moral and existential fortitude required to apply that knowledge authentically in life. Psychologically, this gap is evident in countless patterns of self-sabotage and inaction. Cognitive behavioral therapy teaches awareness of thought distortions, and neuroscience maps the reward circuitry associated with procrastination, fear, and avoidance. Yet countless individuals understand these mechanisms and remain trapped in familiar, unproductive patterns. Awareness alone does not compel action because behavior is determined not only by knowledge, but by emotion, habit, and existential courage. The mind may know, but the self must choose, and it is here, in the act of choice, that psychology meets its limits. Narratively, consider the story of an individual who understands every principle of productivity, every bias that slows decision-making, and every psychological trap that leads to mediocrity, yet continues to drift. Despite awareness, fear persists, comfort dominates, hesitation paralyzes. Knowledge, in isolation, becomes inert. Conversely, the moment they act, step into discomfort, confront risk, make a decision despite uncertainty, transformation begins. Psychology could explain the paralysis, but it cannot grant the courage, nor the lived experience that bridges understanding and action. This is the existential frontier beyond explanation, where knowledge meets life. Emotionally, the unteachable dimension of responsibility is bound up with fear, doubt, and the raw intensity of human experience. Knowledge may illuminate consequences, yet the experience of risk, loss, or sacrifice cannot be learned vicariously. Each individual must confront these emotional truths directly, through lived experience. The psychological models provide guidance, predict patterns, and frame possibilities, but they cannot replicate the visceral, existential challenge of being human, the trembling moment before a choice, the uncertainty of action, and the personal accountability that follows. Socially, psychology also encounters limits. Advice, interventions, and therapeutic frameworks can provide tools, but they cannot live your life for you. You cannot outsource courage, wisdom, or the confrontation with mortality. Societal norms, peer influence, and cultural expectation may inform behavior, yet the deepest truths remain solitary, existing within the arena of personal responsibility. Each human being must navigate their own landscape of choices, confront consequences, and bear the weight of decision. This is the domain that psychology cannot reach, the realm of moral and existential agency. Cognitively, the gap between understanding and action is reinforced by neural architecture. Knowledge alone rarely activates the prefrontal circuits required for sustained self-regulation in the face of emotional arousal, habit, or stress. Awareness may prime the brain for reflection, yet transformation requires repeated, deliberate practice, a translation of understanding into sustained behavior. In essence, psychology can reveal what is happening, why it happens, and how one might intervene, but the act of intervention, the living, breathing enactment of choice, remains uniquely human and unteachable. Philosophically, this limitation is liberating rather than despairing. Nietzsche emphasizes the importance of self-overcoming. Life is not about passive understanding, but about the active, courageous pursuit of becoming. Kierkegaard's leap reminds us that authenticity emerges only in the moment of existential decision. Psychology illuminates patterns, provides frameworks, and guides reflection, but it is through action, confrontation, and commitment that knowledge becomes wisdom. Gratitude, courage, resilience, and fulfillment are not downloaded from insight. They are forged in the crucible of lived experience. Ultimately, the one thing psychology cannot teach you is the art of living, the deliberate, courageous, and accountable engagement with your own life. Awareness, reflection, and understanding are all necessary, yet insufficient. Transformation occurs not in theory but in practice, not in knowing but in choosing. Subscribing offers continued guidance into these intersections of thought, behavior, and existential insight, equipping you to bridge the gap between understanding and action, knowledge, and lived reality. The central challenge remains: will you remain a passive observer of your own life, or will you step into the tension of choice, responsibility, and authentic transformation? Understanding human behavior, emotions, and thought processes is profoundly illuminating, yet there is a fundamental limitation. Knowing how we function does not automatically equip us to transcend our limitations. Psychology maps the terrain of the mind, offering insights into motivation, bias, and decision-making, but the journey across that terrain, the act of transformation, remains uniquely personal, existential, and unteachable. The difference between understanding and action is the chasm that separates ordinary lives from extraordinary ones, and it is here that most people falter. Consider the concept of procrastination. Countless studies explain why humans delay, the role of dopamine in reinforcing avoidance, and the cognitive distortions that magnify fear and overestimate risk. Yet knowing these mechanisms rarely stops the cycle. Millions understand the psychology of procrastination, but continue to defer critical tasks, delaying growth, fulfillment, and meaningful change. Knowledge illuminates the problem, but cannot generate the willpower, courage, or emotional engagement required to act. Here, the existential dimension, the willingness to bear discomfort, uncertainty, and personal responsibility, becomes paramount, and it is precisely this dimension that psychology cannot teach. Philosophically, Kierkegaard's ideas on anxiety and freedom reveal why this gap exists. Anxiety is not merely a negative emotion. It is the awareness of potential and possibility, the recognition that choice carries risk, responsibility, and consequence. It is simultaneously paralyzing and liberating. Knowledge may reduce uncertainty and predict outcomes, but the emotional weight of choice, the confrontation with risk, and the necessity of commitment remain inescapable. The leap from understanding to action cannot be prescribed, it must be lived. Narratives of extraordinary human achievement illustrate this divide. Consider the writer who studies narrative theory, understands literary structures, and knows the psychology of readership, yet fails to write a single sentence. Or the entrepreneur who comprehends market psychology, reads case studies, and masters business frameworks, yet never launches a venture. Understanding is necessary, but inert without courageous action. Transformation demands engaging the self fully, risking failure, and embracing uncertainty, experiences that cannot be taught but must be felt and enacted personally. Socially, this gap is reinforced by dependence on external frameworks. People often seek guidance, systems, or rules to dictate action, believing that adherence will ensure transformation. Psychology provides these frameworks, yet they can become a crutch rather than a bridge. Following steps, memorizing principles, or consulting theories can create the illusion of growth while leaving action deferred. True progress emerges when individuals internalize responsibility, engage fully with risk, and act decisively in the absence of guarantees, the domain where psychology reaches its limit. Emotionally, the human mind resists transformation because action carries inherent uncertainty. Knowledge comforts by explaining patterns, but comfort is a seductive form of stagnation. The emotional resistance to change, fear of failure, social judgment, and self-doubt cannot be eliminated through understanding alone. Courage is not a concept, it is an experience. Confidence is not learned, it is forged through the repeated act of doing what is difficult, uncomfortable, or frightening. Psychology can illuminate the resistance, but the confrontation with it must be undertaken individually. Cognitively, neuroscience reinforces this distinction. Prefrontal regions, responsible for executive function and decision-making, are engaged not by observation but by repeated, deliberate practice. Neuroplasticity supports learning through action, failure, and adaptation. Awareness of principles or patterns stimulates reflection, but does not replicate the neural rewiring that occurs when one acts in the face of uncertainty. Understanding provides the map, experience builds the pathway. Without action, the potential for transformation remains dormant. Behaviorally, bridging this gap requires deliberate strategies that emphasize practice over theory. Daily choices, intentional exposure to discomfort, and commitment to consistent action cultivate courage and resilience. Incremental risk-taking, reflective journaling on experience, and real-world experimentation allow knowledge to move from abstraction into lived reality. Philosophy and psychology provide guidance and context, but the essential element, engaging fully with the unknown, remains beyond teaching. Ultimately, the chasm between knowledge and action defines the human condition. Psychology explains, predicts, and illuminates. Philosophy frames meaning and responsibility. Yet the act of living authentically, making courageous choices, and bearing the consequences cannot be transmitted. It must be experienced. Recognition of this truth is liberating. The limits of psychology reveal the domain of personal sovereignty, the space where growth, transformation, and fulfillment are earned rather than prescribed. Subscribing to a channel that explores these intersections between thought, emotion, and action offers guidance for navigating the invisible space between knowing and doing. It reinforces reflection, encourages engagement, and provides a framework for turning understanding into lived experience. But the ultimate responsibility remains yours. The leap across the chasm cannot be taken for you. The one thing psychology cannot teach you, the raw, unmediated courage to act, is not an insurmountable barrier. It is a frontier, a challenge, a space where awareness meets action, and where knowledge is transformed into lived experience. To cross this divide, one must cultivate intentional practices, philosophical grounding, and psychological strategies that translate insight into real-world transformation. This is where ordinary understanding becomes extraordinary life. Philosophically, bridging this gap begins with radical responsibility. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and the Stoics all emphasize that authentic living requires the acknowledgement that your life is the product of your choices, and that meaningful growth cannot be outsourced, theorized, or deferred. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that every day, each action, and each thought is an opportunity to exercise agency. Recognizing this, one begins to see knowledge not as an endpoint, but as a tool, a map guiding action, a framework for reflection, and a catalyst for engagement. The moment of choice, small or large, becomes sacred. Psychologically, bridging the gap demands deliberate confrontation with fear and resistance. Awareness of cognitive biases, procrastination tendencies, and emotional triggers is insufficient unless it motivates repeated, intentional action. Growth mindset research highlights that effort, practice, and persistence are more predictive of success than innate intelligence. The act of doing, confronting discomfort, experimenting, failing, and iterating rewires the brain, strengthens executive function, and cultivates resilience. Neuroscience confirms that repeated exposure to challenges develops neural pathways associated with decision-making, self-control, and emotional regulation, creating the internal architecture for sustained action. Behaviorally, creating a system of small, deliberate actions builds momentum. Writing a page a day, making one courageous choice, speaking a truth previously avoided, these incremental steps compound into substantial transformation. The ordinary mind underestimates the power of accumulation. Psychology provides insight into patterns, habit formation, and motivation, but the cumulative effect emerges only through consistent engagement. Each step, though small, is an enactment of courage that moves insight from theory into life. Emotionally, embracing discomfort is central. Growth is rarely comfortable. Transformation is rarely painless. Fear, uncertainty, and self-doubt are not obstacles but signals, indicators that one is approaching meaningful change. Nietzsche called this the necessity of struggle, the idea that greatness emerges through tension and effort. Psychology can explain the origin of fear, but it cannot substitute for the lived experience of acting despite it. The cultivation of courage, patience, and persistence transforms fear into a companion rather than a barrier. Socially, intentional engagement amplifies transformation. Surrounding oneself with individuals who challenge, inspire, and hold one accountable is crucial. The herd instinct, which Nietzsche so vividly critiqued, can be redirected. Communities of ambitious, reflective, and courageous individuals reinforce action, normalize risk-taking, and cultivate a culture of deliberate growth. Conversely, social environments that tolerate inaction or celebrate comfort reinforce inertia. Choice of companions, collaborators, and mentors becomes a deliberate tool for bridging the knowledge-action divide. Cognitively, reflection combined with deliberate practice ensures that lessons learned are integrated into identity. Journaling, self-assessment, and iterative planning allow insight to inform behavior, while repeated action ingrains transformation at the neural and experiential level. Philosophy guides perspective, psychology provides understanding, but it is the disciplined enactment of choice that turns potential into reality. Knowledge becomes wisdom, not through comprehension, but through lived application. Narratively, the individuals who cross this divide share common traits: courage in the face of uncertainty, willingness to fail repeatedly, and relentless commitment to self-examination. They understand that knowledge alone is inert, yet they leverage insight to guide disciplined action. They embrace discomfort, confront fear, and persist despite setbacks. Their transformation is visible not in the accumulation of facts, but in the shape of their lives, purposeful, intentional, and profoundly alive. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Psychology cannot teach you courage, accountability, or the existential act of living intentionally. These are cultivated through deliberate, repeated engagement with life itself. Knowledge illuminates, guides, and predicts. Action transforms. The one thing psychology cannot teach is the experience of becoming, of choosing, of living beyond mere awareness. Subscribing ensures continued exploration of this intersection between thought, understanding, and action, offering insights, guidance, and reflection to help bridge the gap between knowing and living fully. Yet the decisive leap remains yours. Every choice, every step into discomfort, and every deliberate act of engagement is a declaration that your life will not be a passive reflection of insight, but an active enactment of potential. The ultimate question lingers: will you remain a passive observer of your own mind, or will you cross the chasm between knowledge and action, embracing the transformation that only lived experience can teach?